there was a man named Gordon Cooper, who most of you may know was someone who gave us testimony about the craft that landed on the dry lake bed in California, Edwards Range, back in 1956, I believe it was, that his crew filmed, and he saw the film footage and sent it back to the Pentagon. Well, Gordon Cooper, a very heroic figure, an early Mercury astronaut, and I were speaking to a conservative group called the Federalist Society here in Washington, who were very interested in this, because they were interested in the unconstitutionality, because they're strict constitutional. And I will speak to any group, I don't care, you know, I mean, it's fine, politics, I don't care. So, I mean, I agree with the group's politics all the way through, but they were interested, and they invited me and Gordon Cooper, so we went. So, my wife was with me. It was here at the Hyatt, I think, near Capitol Hill. And I was going, so I started talking to Gordon and comparing notes of people we had talked to within the system. And he had been asked by Secretary of Defense Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, who was Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, Secretary of Defense, had asked him directly to give him all the actionable intelligence, all the details needed about that landing event of a craft at the dry lake bed in 1956, because he wanted to see that footage. And he got back to Gordon Cooper and said, I can't find it. It's not accessible. It's in this unacknowledged project, and the Secretary of Defense. So there's another person proven out of the loop. So I started making a list of all the people who had been denied access, who by all rights absolutely must know if it's a legal program. Secretary of Defense, President of the United States, CIA Director, on and on and on. Then I end up, a couple years after this, getting invited to brief the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes. Now, General Patrick Hughes was a man, you'd often see him with Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton and other people. He was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is like the CIA for the Pentagon. It's almost as large. And it's their in-house intelligence shop, whereas, you know, the CIA is a civilian agency, but this is a military intelligence. But the Defense Intelligence Agency is sort of sits on top of all military intelligence. And he was the director. So, and he's a 3-star general. So I get invited to brief General Patrick Hughes at the Pentagon. So I think, well, let's see what he knows. Of course, he wanted to know what I knew. So again, I sent him a full dossier and briefing prior to arriving so he'd be adequately brought up to speed. We had a meeting scheduled. I go to the Pentagon, full military escorts in, like you always have in these areas. And I go in, and we start talking about this. And he says, well, I find this amazingly interesting. He says, but in all my years in the military, I have never been told anything about it. Nothing. And I said, well, it doesn't surprise me. There are other people in your position. He says, he got up and he went over to a bookshelf. And on it was a little, like you'd get at a toy store, a little E.T. doll, like about this big. And he grabbed it and he says, this is all I've gotten for my inquiries about this issue through channels. In other words, someone gave it to him as a gag gift. Now, there was a full bird colonel sitting at the table during this briefing, and I started explaining the way, you know, these particular, and he knew what an unacknowledged special access project was. This is no, he says, but he didn't know about this one. And he wasn't being, he says, well, I can't imagine that there are operations within the Defense Intelligence Agency that know about this, and they wouldn't tell me when I've asked. I said, well, they do. I mean, they lied to the president, they lied to the CIA director, and they'll lie to you. And the colonel visibly stiffened. Because I said at that moment, there are people on your senior staff who are tasked with this issue, but they don't want you to know for whatever reason. And this colonel stiffened. And my military advisor and I compared notes later, that guy was on the inside lying to the general. The colonel was zooming the general. Illegal? Yes. Treason? Yes. Happens every single day at the Pentagon and CIA. So when you're dealing with an unacknowledged special access project this sensitive. So these are not conspiracy theories. I've been there. I'm the guy who set up these meetings and was there. And I will say that I'm the only civilian you'll ever meet who's had meetings of this nature with people like that all over the world. So I wanted to put this on the record. Now, after this, we had about a 15-minute discussion, and then the general told me something very surprising. He says, you know, my father, this is General Patrick Hughes telling me, my father knew of some kind of illegal conspiracy in the US government back in the 50s and 60s, because he apparently was also a very high official, that was so serious, and we thought the old man was a kook, referring to his father. And he says, I thought this would all be nonsense until I got into this office, until I became the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and contrasted with what I'm being told with what I've seen received from the Disclosure Project, well, Project Starlight at that time. And he said that, you know, my father was so upset by this, he eventually ate his gun, committed suicide. And, yeah. You know, and, you know, so the weight of this is huge, huge. So I said, well, you know, you just move on. But he said, I don't know what I can do because they're not going to tell me anything. I said, but I have Disclosure Project witnesses inside the DIA who've seen satellite imagery of ET craft out in space. We have their testimony. He says, well, they won't tell me anything. So, of course, what you realize is that these positions rotate. They're there for a year or two or 3 or 4. The president, if he's lucky, 8. But there's this permanent system. So let's call it the permanent secret government versus the one that sort of is this revolving door of folks. Sometimes the people in that system know and sometimes they don't. And since the mid-1950s, the criteria for being on the inside of the secrecy is the following. And this is how I explained it to a 5-star admiral in England who is also one of our witnesses, Admiral Lord Hill Norton. He was the head of the Ministry of Defense, and he was a Sea Lord, they called them back then. They don't have 5-star admirals anymore. And he was the head of the military committee for NATO. So I went to his cottage in Hampshire some years ago. Emily dropped me off, took the kids to Salisbury Cathedral, I believe, and I continued on, had a meeting with the admiral. And you know, you get a picture of what my life must be like. So nuts. Completely nuts. So anyway, so I'm there with this man, and we're sitting in some wingback chairs in his parlor in what he called his cottage in Hampshire, and which is a gorgeous old antiquity house with the thatched roofs and beautiful. And we started talking about this. He was a very fastidious man. He had a little teeny notepad like this and a pen, and assiduously taking notes, very, very. And we got to this question, and he said, well, you know, the entire time I was the head of the Ministry of Defense, which also means you're head of MI5 and MI6 and the intelligence units in England. It's the same position there. It's separate here. You have CIA Director and Secretary of Defense. There it's one head. And he says, this issue was never briefed to me. I was never told anything. And I said, yeah, that doesn't surprise me now. It would have maybe a number of years ago. And he said, and as military, the head of the military committee for NATO, I was never told, even though I now have learned NATO was dealing with some of these events, such as the big events that were in Belgium with the massive triangular craft and things like that. Well, I said, he says, and I want to know why they wouldn't tell me. It was like his pride was a sense of propriety. Oh, he was a lord in the House of Lords also. He says, why wouldn't they tell me? And it was a little bit petulant, but also hurt. And I said, well, let me answer your question with a question. And he didn't like that. He thought I was being a cheeky American. And I said, but just bear with me. What would you have done if you found out that there was a cabal that had run amok of the laws of all the democracies, that had this information and had the technologies to completely fix the environment, end global poverty, create a civilization that would be sustainable for thousands of years with these types of free energy technologies? and that they had killed people to keep this secret, assassinated people, and broken the laws of their country and their solemn oaths to uphold their constitutions to do so. He says, I wouldn't have stood for it for a bloody minute. I said, that's why they didn't tell you. I said, the first thing they do when they make a decision that you're in and you're out of the loop of this issue is whether you'll go along with the secret agenda. If you're going to go along with the secret agenda, they'll tell you. And they'll give you a little bit, and then a little bit, and then a little bit, and bring you up through the system. If they think that you're the kind of stand-up person who would be appalled when they find out what the criminality of this group is, and how illegal it is, and what damage they're doing to the earth and to the humanity by keeping it secret, and that you might blow the whistle on it like Jack Kennedy was planning to do in his second term. That's why they took him out. And that's why they took out Marilyn Monroe. I have a document to prove it. And a top secret document from the NSA vault. It's in my first book. Go read it. Nobody reads anymore. But anyway, what was interesting is that he looked at me, he says, that is it then. I said, yes. They do a soul biopsy, like doctors do biopsies. They do a soul biopsy and a psychological analysis to see if you would be willing to go along with that agenda. If you are willing to go along with it, they'll give you little bits until you rise up through the system. If you divert from the system, they take you out. You're going to be dead. So they've learned not to be too reckless with who they tell because they don't want to have to kill too many people and leave bodies scattered that looks conspicuous, like they did in the 50s and 60s. With John Foster Dulles and President Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe and other famous people. So I said, that's why it's managed this way. Now, you may have had a predecessor who was MOD head, who came up through that system, who knew all about these projects. So it doesn't have anything to do with your rank. It has to do with your values. It has to do with your willingness to go along with an agenda that is the most criminal, evil, dangerous agenda that any potentates have ever had in the history of the world that we know of. And that's what we're dealing with this super secret Magi group. And they are not going to be reckless in who they read into and pull into those projects. So that is something you have to understand. Now, let's fast forward to the congressional initiatives, which I began in the mid-90s. So I mentioned the chairman of the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee, Dan Burton. There was a man, many of you who were low income, like myself. I was very poor growing up. Probably went to college on something called a Pell Grant. Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island started the Pell Grants, sponsored that bill. And he was at a meeting with the Noetic Sciences Institute, and I did a briefing for him and met with him there. And it was very interesting because here was he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Very key committee, foreign relations. And he said, you know, I've wondered about this my entire career. We've made inquiries. We've never been given any information through channels. And he said, would you come to Washington and do a briefing for my staff? I said, well, sure, anytime I can come up. I was still living in North Carolina then. And he said, oh, wonderful. And then I looked at him and I said, you know, Senator, the problem with all this is that you're a good man who should be representing humanity to these visitors from interstellar civilizations. And you've been deprived of dealing with the ultimate foreign relations issue, interplanetary relations. And he looked at me through his horn-rimmed glasses and went, you know, Dr. Greer, I'm afraid you may be right. I said, well, I am. Very poignant moment, but that was the way it was. And then I met with Senator Dick Bryan of Nevada, whose home state has, of course, Nellis Air Force Base and the so-called Area 51. He had no knowledge of these projects. So I met with him in a kind of a clandestine little meeting at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. He was flying in, I was flown in, put on one of those little beeping carts, taken to something that looked like a janitor's closet, opened it up, it was a VIP holding area, and I met with the senator. And we were talking about this. He says, I have never been told anything about this when we've gone into the secure, the SCIFs for the intelligence briefings. And so I provide a briefing to him. And it goes on and on and on and on. I mean, the numbers of people I personally briefed, you know, of course, you know, you probably all know about, you know, briefing, oh, I'm blocking on his name, Kucinich, who ran for president in 08. And Kucinich was very interested in this, but he wouldn't hold a hearing either, even when he was the chairman of the subcommittee for domestic government reform and oversight. He had had a sighting. Shirley MacLaine outed him during the campaign and embarrassed him. He's very supportive of disclosure. I have his information, I mean, we stay in contact, but he wouldn't hold a hearing.